Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, July 13th, 2022. Today is Sunday, July 10th, 2022. We are in the first chapter of 1 Samuel at verse 21, and we're going to try to get all the way through Hannah's prayer. It's all one passage. It's a lot there. Today we did have a good sermon. Oscar gave a great message on Monsters of the Mind, and I hope you got to hear it. If you didn't, go out to the church website and look at it and pay attention to the wisdom that's there. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 21, when the man Elkanah went up with his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, said to her. "Stay here until you have weaned him, only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought them to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. The dedication is fairly simple. This is the Levite dedication. It's what's required of dedicating somebody to be a Levite. She was making it, and she was offering him to the Lord for his whole life. There was not going to be an end to this. Most people that became a Levite did so for a prescribed period of time. They did it for 28 days, or they did it for 3 months, or they did it for a year, or whatever. And if for some reason they didn't fulfill part of that vow and became unclean in there, they were supposed to then dedicate themselves again for the time they missed. And basically from when they became unclean to the end, whatever that long would be. So, if they dedicated themselves for 21 days and 14 days into it, they became unclean. When they became clean again, they still had 7 days left to their vow, and so they dedicated themselves again for 7 days. Samuel had no option to do that. He was going to be dedicated his whole life. He could never, ever violate the Levite vow. I'm sure he learned the details of the Levite vow from Eli and the other priest. But his mother apparently didn't understand the full implications, but she knew what the proper sacrifice was. Of course, it is very easy for his father to say, in one of those years when he was not going up, because he wasn't weaned yet, to ask, "Hey, my wife has a son, she's going to dedicate him as a Levite, what's the sacrifice?" So when I bring him, I can ask, I can bring it. And so he does. He's obviously observant. He's going up every year with his family. And then Hannah comes to Eli and says, "This is the son that I asked God for. You remember me? I was the woman that was silent and praying, and God granted the request. Here is the answer to the prayer." And he worshiped the Lord there. In English, that's a little unclear who it was that was worshiping God because of the answered prayer, whether that was Samuel or Elkanah, his dad, or Eli. in the Hebrew, it's a little more obvious. It's Eli. Eli is the one worshiping God. He got to see the answered prayer. Um, at that point, he probably understood that God spoke through him, even though he may not have at that moment understood that he was answering God's prayer, the prayer to God, speaking God's speaking. The people of the time, because it handled, the prayer was answered, would have interpreted it that whether God used Eli directly and Eli knew it or not, that God had spoken through Eli. And that kind of thing does happen today. Sometimes God will just use circumstances and somebody will speak something, and in hindsight, we see how God spoke through them. Um, it, you know, it was not to the level that we would have called prophetic in the sense of, Isaiah understanding what God was going to do in the future and saying it, and predicting the future, and but more pastoral. And just a pastor at a church sees a need and understands Scripture and knows that this is God's will and says it, and then God does bring it to pass because people of faith prayed for it, and He answers that prayer positively. This is more the aspect that Eli had. He was the pastor to the people. He was shepherding the sheep, and he was the head guy in charge, or at this time he was probably emeritus. He was the ex-high priest and still involved, but too old to do the heavy work that needed to be done. And his sons were doing the heavy work, and he was therefore in that ministerial role, not slaughtering sheep and goats and bulls and cooking the flesh and feeding people and all that kind of thing, keeping the fires tended, and the other things the priest had to do. And he could actually spend more time understanding what people's needs were and hearing about them and keeping up with things. And he got to see this answered prayer. So he worshiped God. He knows his ministry is not impotent. Chapter 2, verse 1, and I'm going to read the whole prayer before I stop and make any comments. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hired themselves out for food, but those who were hungry hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. Upon them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails, but those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy ministered before the Lord under Eli the priest. Now, this prayer, it's possible that she prayed it spontaneously, and that she remembered it, and the people around her, Elkanah and Eli and the other members of the family remembered it. It's very unlikely. It is. It was memorized and kept, yes, but it's very likely in those years where she did not go up to Shiloh to worship the Lord with the family that she spent time composing what she would pray to God out loud as thanks for the gift He gave her. This is typical of the time. They would, since they were a very oral culture and memorized things well, and she probably spent some time composing it. We, being a written culture, would have spent some time writing it down and then had a page to read. Um, if we thought we were really advanced, we would have written it down and memorized it and stood there with it in front of us in case we got stage fright and froze up, and uh, quoted. Um, it was very expensive to write things down at that time. Uh, Paper was not yet invented. You had to either take bulrushes and cut them very thin and let them partially dry and then weave them together while they were still pliable and sticky, and then let that dry and surface it. And basically, you did that and you did as flat as you could and let it dry, and then you took sandpaper and sanded both sides to make it thin enough and flat enough, and then you had something to write on. That's papyrus, by the way. And or you took the skin of a calf and tanned it a certain way and split it thinwise, and then sanded the rough side of that, and you made a writing instrument that way. That's vellum. And both of those are very labor intensive processes. And then you took minerals and plant materials and you ground the minerals very fine and you extracted certain things out of the minerals with the plant materials, and you made this ink that then you would take a goose or duck quill and cut the tip, or a wood stylus and cut the tip in a special way and dip it in the ink and draw it on the, I'm going to call it paper, the vellum or the papyrus. And when it dried, it bonded to the paper, I'm going to call it paper just because that's our term, and became permanent. And there was a reaction between the dissolved mineral in the ink and the substrate, and it depends upon which substrate you chose, which ink you made, and etc. What was around also. Those, if you heard me describe it correctly, you recognize making vellum took months, making papyrus took weeks. Making the ink depends upon how far away the minerals were, but you may have had to either travel or pay somebody else to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to get the right minerals to bring to you, then to grind them by hand or mortar and pestle, and harvest the right plants at the right time of the year, extract the juices out of them, the right things, and then mix the two and make this ink. When it dried, it was basically useless, so you had to keep it moist and sealed, um, and use it quickly. Yeah, it was expensive. You didn't lightly write stuff down. Um, our ballpoint pen and ink, um, writing utensils, and paper produced from pine trees, where you know a single pine tree can make tens of thousands of pages or hundreds of thousands of pages, and paper mills can turn out, you know, thousands of trees a day into paper. Just, you know, it's an amazing difference in scale and at cost. You know, We think it's expensive when we go down and it costs us $1 to buy a ream of paper. You know, uh, they would think that that was so blinking cheap. Um, anyway, she has this prayer that she means to give to God at the tabernacle when she dedicates her son. And so she composes it, she memorizes it, she says it there. Others hear it and memorize it too. Now, she probably may have actually had Samuel memorize it also as she composed it in the meantime. Her family may have heard her composing it and memorized it before she got there and made sure she quoted it correctly. Um, this is the way that composition went there. And people that were concerned with her probably helped her and made suggestions for how to improve it. Just like poets today get together in poet circles and read each other's stuff and make suggestions, and the suggestions may or may not get taken, but they improve each other and stimulate each other. The same kind of thing would have been done here. Now let's look at the theology of what she says, because it's actually pretty deep. Um, she may not have been learned and schooled in the way we think of, but she understood God in a deep sense, which tells me Elkanah was not just observant and went and worshiped and was ignorant of God. He knew things about God. They probably had large portions of what was known about God memorized at that point in time, which at this point in time was probably the Pentateuch. Maybe a few stories that became part of the Judges. Possibly some things that didn't ultimately get written down but are truthful or even apocryphal. But God chose not to put in Scripture. So she prayed, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance." She's thanking God, praising God, because her prayer is answered. And she's happy about it. She's rejoicing, and she knows it's God that did it. Um, uh, the idiom, "my horn is lifted up." Horn is a symbol of strength in Jewish culture at that time, in Hebrew culture. And her strength is lifted up. Um, it's the Lord that did it. It's in the Lord that her strength is lifted. She didn't do this. She could not conceive by herself. If she could have, she wouldn't have been in the tabernacle praying. She would have been pregnant years ago. She wouldn't have been tormented by her sister wife. She knows this is an answer from God, and that He is the one that did it, and that He strengthened her. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. Now, who were her enemies? She's actually being hyperbolic when she calls them enemies. She's not an enemy with her sister wife, Elkanah's other wife. But that's the woman that tormented her. There's probably women in the village of Ramah that tormented her too. I mean, everybody knew her, probably called her barren, which was a curse word. Truthful, but a curse word. Not her fault, but they're assuming it's a curse of God. And they're using it that way. And she's contended with them, but she doesn't necessarily hate them. She doesn't want them killed. She doesn't expect them to want her killed. But they're the people she contended with. She hasn't had to confront the reality of war during her time. Enemies didn't come in and ransack the community. She hasn't had to, you know, either run and hide or stand in as the last line of defense for home and hearth. Um, she's not really seen a real enemy. But the one she's contended with, the Lord has delivered her from them because they can no longer make fun of her for being barren. She is not barren, she has a child. And she's going to fulfill this vow, this promise she made to God, to give him to God. And she has. This is probably part of the ceremony of giving him over. And the ones that are there that tormented her, yeah, they know she's speaking about them, that she's speaking to God and how God delivered her from them. There is no one holy like the Lord. No one besides you. There's no rock like our God. Um, you know, God is the only one that's other, that's set apart, that is pure. Um, there's no one like him. He's unique. He is steadfast. A rock was considered to be steadfast. It was protective. It was concealing. It was strong in the sense of defensive strong. It was passive in one sense. But they also recognize God is so mighty that even his passive is more powerful than our active. We normally think of active actions being stronger than passive actions. Not necessarily true. Um, when you're speaking about God and the infinity of God, his passive actions are stronger than any of our active actions. And she's recognizing that he has been her defense and her strength and her bearing up under all the travail she's been through. Do not keep talking so proudly, or let your mouth speak such arrogance, for the Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed. She's giving warning that, every word of your mouth will be judged by God. He knows, and he keeps a record. And you will be held accountable. They had some concept of eternity. Abraham talks about eternity. Isaac talks about it. Jacob talks about it. Moses talks about it. But it's not a big part of the theology. But they have this kind of innate recognition that this life cannot be all there is, because they can see around them that justice does not happen in this life, but they have this innate faith that God brings justice, that he is just. And while this is an example of justice happening, not all the justice happens in this life. And therefore, you got to be careful, because you don't know what the next life is like. And they had the concept of Sheol, the place of the dead, that you didn't cease to exist when you died. Your body decayed, but your being left the body, but you then existed in this other state. And they didn't know much about it. But they knew you continue to exist. And, who knows what God could do to you there. And so, she's giving this warning. Don't be proud. Don't talk. Don't be aggressive. Don't be arrogant. Because God's listening. God's hearing. God's going to make justice happen. Even if it's not in this life, he will make justice happen. That is a faith statement, that there is a judgment. She didn't know any details about it. There's no theology about it. But they know it has to happen. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. They who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry hunger no more. She who is barren was born 7 children, but she who has many sons pines away. Um, a series of examples of kinds of things that God can do. Uh, the strong warrior gets defeated. The weak warrior wins the battle. The barren woman has a bunch of children. The woman with a bunch of children gets bereaved and they're all dead. Um, if you're a great farmer and you had a lot to eat, you go hungry despite your best efforts. If you couldn't make your rocky ground grow a single crop, but you're faithful to God, God feeds you anyway, etc., 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 etc. She's giving all these examples, and they're not necessarily specific examples. She's not saying, hey, at this date in the past, so and so was in this condition and this happened and now he's this, no, 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 no. But on the other hand, it was the kind of things that people would know have happened. Um, there's been things that happened, and they're part of the cultural parlance. The gossip line has talked about how somebody over there ended up in this situation, and somebody over there ended up in that situation. And she's acknowledging that God does this, whether it's bringing the proud down or the humble up, and that fortunes reverse. And she's giving credit to God for all reversal of fortune, whether it's for betterment or for worse. She recognizes that if you're strong and continuously strong, that's from God. If you're weak and continuously weak, whether that is partly your own fault or totally your own fault or not your fault at all, that's still directed by God, because He made you choose the evil path or choose to do the wrong thing at the wrong moment, or made you unable to overcome your difficulties. Just she's acknowledging that God's the one that directs paths. And don't count your current condition as the final form, because she knows things can reverse and change. She's a good example of that. She was barren for a long time. She was despised. She was taunted. And now she has a son, and vindicated that she knew she was not at fault. Verse 6, the Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down the grave and raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. Again, a series of examples of God reversing fortune. These are more general, but they're the kinds of things she's been talking about in the past few verses, and she acknowledges God's the one that does that. And again, the people would have known examples around them of things that happened like that. We can talk about that same kind of thing today. I mean, you look at those and we know it happens. Now, they would not have known of anybody that had died and came back to life. We do have stories in Scripture, some miracles of some prophets, and etc. And of course, Jesus himself and some of his disciples performing miracles, or God working miracles through them. And she probably was referring to, and makes alive again, somebody that had been equivalent of so sick or so injured on the battlefield that everybody gave them up for dead. This is beyond what we can heal. If they survive, it's God's will. And then they survive and get well. And, even if they had a disability the rest of their life, the people would have recognized you should be dead and you're not. It's a miracle of God, and even if you're weak and you have to hobble around on a cane the rest of your life, you should be in the grave and you're not. So it's a miracle of God. This is the kind of thing she's mentioning here. They would have seen it. That they would have, um, and she knows they have that God has that kind of strength, and that He reverses fortune. That the very poorest can become uh, companions to the very strong and very wealthiest and very most important people, if God chooses to. Or they can stay very poor and groveling on the ash heap, which was this kind of symbol of mourning and lowliness and humility and being unable to help yourself. Um, you know, Middle of verse 8. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's, and upon them He has set the world. He will guard the feet of His saints, but the wicked will be silenced in darkness. Um, she's acknowledging that God made the earth and that He knows everything about it, how the foundation of the earth is. Um, you know, they knew from what little bit they knew about the world that they used the top couple of inches or maybe a feet or two of the earth to grow crops. There was people who mined the earth, dug down deep. In that day and time, a couple hundred feet was really, really deep. I think the deepest mine at that point in time was several thousand feet deep, but it was built into an area with some natural caves. So who knows how much of it was hand dug and how much of it was just an extension of God's already work. They did not have the technology to shore up mines and make mining tunnels and stuff. It was all done by hand. And if part of what they mined out collapsed, well, you hoped you weren't in it when it collapsed, or you could get out before it trapped you, because you were dead if it trapped you or you were crushed, and nobody was going to recover your body. You were just dead. Nobody's going to dig you out, even if you were still alive down in there. You couldn't dig in further than you were willing to risk. If I start to feel the earth tremble, can I run out before it collapses? How much was profit worth? It was not yet at the point of scale that people forced the lowliest of slaves to work in mines. It was for free men that had the daring to dig in the dirt and dig in the ground. And it was a risky profession. And you should benefit by being very wealthy and your family being very wealthy, because you're going to risk your life for it. It was viewed as more risky than war and being a warrior, and you were rewarded for it more. Later, it became viewed as being so risky that only slaves were allowed to go in mines, and they were forced to go work. And if they died, well, that's just the cost of mining. That hadn't taken a hold yet in the world. It wasn't that risky yet. That free men weren't willing to. So, they know that there's stuff down below their feet and down deeper, and that God has a foundation down there somewhere. They don't know what it is. It's an unknown, and they know that it's unknown. But they know there's something down there. And they know He's set the world on it, that He knows it, and He's built it. And she's acknowledging that His knowledge is bigger than theirs. And that if He has that kind of power, that He builds it, and He knows about things that they're ignorant of, that He will guard His people, the righteous. But the wicked will be silenced. And silenced in darkness is an allusion to death. that even if the wicked are not killed for their wickedness, when they die, God will silence them. That they will be judged in the afterlife. They don't know what the afterlife is. It's as mysterious to them as the foundations of the earth. When all you can do to discover it is dig by hand with basically, a shovel and a hoe and a pickaxe and take it out in a bucketful. Wheelbarrows were not yet invented. Sledges were the way that you um, did things like that. Um, Ox carts were available, but they hadn't yet invented the single-wheeled contrivance to take stuff out. The main way people, when they dug a pit in the ground, is you put essentially a big bucket on either end of a pole and put it across your shoulders, filled up both buckets, tried to make the buckets such that when they were full, you could barely pick it up and you could walk out with it, because the walking was hard and you had to carry as much as you could every time. It wasn't easy. And so you tried to get as much every time you could. A very tough way to do that kind of work, particularly if when you went in, you had to carry it in and then fill it up and then walk out with it, and then go do something with it and then go back in and get more. You know, middle of verse 9. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder against them from the heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. It's not strength that causes one to prevail, but God's favor. Now, He may favor somebody with strength and use their strength to, have them prevail. Samson, for example. But Samson ultimately didn't prevail because he was strong. He prevailed for a while because he was strong. But ultimately, he prevailed when he obeyed God, and he did more damage to the enemies of God in his death than in his life. Likewise, there was wars fought all the time, essentially, in that day and time. And there was warriors all the time, all over the place. And, they would boast about killing the champion on the other side or mourn that the champion on their side was killed. And very rarely was he killed by somebody stronger, because there just wasn't that many people stronger than the strongest on either side. The two strongest might fight each other and one prevail and kill the other, and that would be viewed as the stronger. But sometime, in battle, somebody was smarter about how to do it, craftier, more skillful. And it wasn't brute strength always that won. And, she points that out. And then, the point is, though, God's the one that gives the strength, that gives the victory. And if you oppose God, who can defend you? He's the one that's stronger. He's the one that's craftier. He's the one that's more knowledgeable. He's the one that can do it better and more skilled. If you oppose God, who can defend you? And the truth is, nobody. God has to be the one that defends you, or you can't be defended. If somebody opposes God, He will thunder against them from the heaven. Thunder was viewed as a source of a show of strength. I mean, they understood it was probably the loudest noise they ever heard, and they couldn't generate anything that loud. And God did it routinely. Um, so he had to be a whole lot more powerful than them. And he will thunder from the heavens to demonstrate his strength and his ability. And they understood that hearing thunder indicated that God was stronger than them. The Lord would judge the ends of the earth, that he's going to judge everybody. Um, it's unclear whether they had the concept of individual judgment that Jesus ultimately makes explicit. Um, some of the minor prophets do talk about individual guilt and innocence. Ezekiel makes a big point out of it. Um, but that's a fairly late development, and even in the late Old Testament period, there were those who still thought it was corporate punishment. Um, at this point in history, we don't know how much they viewed it as individual punishment and justice and corporate punishment and justice. They did understood that how the group, the clan, the tribe, the nation did, God responded to that and judged accordingly. And that if you were a righteous person with unrighteous neighbors, you might still be wiped away because you were living among unrighteous people. On the other hand, if you were unrighteous and living among a bunch of righteous people, the Lord might spare you because you were living among righteous people. They recognized that, and they recognized that there was this corporate accountability. And since they were very group-minded, very clannish, that made sense to them. That there might be individual judgment. They could hold that God would judge the group by judging individuals in the group, because let's face it, they felt the loss of every member of the group that died or was taken away by whatever means, whether it was by war or famine or disease or just old age or whatever. So the two were not distinct to them. Individual judgment of God, individual punishment would have caused the group to hurt. And the group to hurt would have caused every individual in it to hurt. They would not have separated those two as separate concepts. That would have been it would have been much later before God develops that in Hebrew thought. Hence, some of the prophets dealing with it is that it wasn't just, a group punishment and I can cheat the system by being more evil and only being punished for the group level of wickedness. That idea by the way, took hold before the Babylonian captivity. And there was kind of a race to the bottom because everybody was trying to get ahead by cheating the system more than everybody else. And, well, we know how that turned out for them. And the prophets that saw it were decrying that and said, no, 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 no. God will get you for being evil. Sure, the society's going to have to suffer because you're evil. But, we allowing you, we're going to have to suffer. But you're going to pay the price yourself, too. And at this point in time, that's not a concept. They very much viewed each other as part of a whole. And the group was the important entity. And how you did things affected the group, and how the group did things affected you. And they would not have drawn a big distinction between the two. And so God judging the ends of the earth. It doesn't matter whether they're talking about a nationwide judgment, a tribe-wide judgment, a clan-wide judgment, a family-wide judgment. a household-wide judgment. Uh, they would have viewed that with the same kind of thing. Even if an individual was judged by God, they would not have viewed that as separate from a larger scale judgment. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, that is an interesting phrase because this is the time of the judges where there is no king in Israel. No earthly king. You see, she understood that God was the king. And so God, Yahweh, will give strength to himself as king and exalt the horn, the strength of his anointed. Now, who at that day and time was his anointed? There was nobody anointed of God except the priest. Priests were anointed to their service to minister before God for the people. Yes, high priests were selected out of that to be above them, to lead them. But the priests were anointed. The priests were God's servants to the people. They served the people from God. They served God. Well, they served the people to God. They served both ways. And they were anointed to that task. So God's the one granting the strength, and he's the king that's getting that strength. And his servants, the priests, their strength was strengthened, their horn. They would be the one that receives that exalting that God gives. That's the understanding she would have had with that statement. She's not talking about King of Israel. That's years in the future. She's probably going to be dead before Saul ever gets anointed king. Because Samuel is a middle-aged man, or what we would consider middle-aged, probably an old man. If she was still alive to see it, she was probably a decrepit, very old woman living in his household. She would not have definitely not been referring to that time. There was so much in the future from her perspective. She's still a young woman, still vigorous, and there's no king in Israel. She knows that. She can't conceive of there being a king. She was probably after the time of Ahimelech and his attempted kingship, and where he claimed to be a king, and everybody ignored him until his followers killed him. He didn't rule over the whole country, the whole nation. He didn't even manage to be king over the whole tribe. He had about 3 or 4 clans under him, and in one tribe, and had some pretty good support there till they turned on him. And then, half of them turned against him, and half of them still supported him, and he lost it. And, everybody took that as God's judgment on trying to be king. And if that was before her time, she probably heard the story. She was from the same tribe. And, it was a point of warning. Don't be an earthly king. They would have seen that other peoples around them had kings, but they were clearly not God's kings. They were earthly kings and opposed to God because they were opposed to God's people. And so his king would be referring to himself. And so very poetic language that God is self-sufficient, God is immensely powerful, infinitely powerful, uncontested, unopposed. Well, he could be opposing him, but you wouldn't be unsuccessfully opposing him if you did. And that's where she ends it. That God is basically sovereign and over everything, all powerful. And she started by thanking God for Samuel, and then she built up to God being this all powerful being, not just the defender of the weak, eh, but she gave examples of him defending the weak or the unfortunate or whatever. But she ends with he's the most powerful. And then they went home, and Samuel was left to minister before the Lord. So, as a preschooler, just barely weaned, he was ministering before God. Now, what was he doing? We have no concept. He wouldn't have been strong enough to haul water or wood. He was probably being taught whatever the priest would want him to do later. Errand boy, things like that. Mending, tending. There's all kinds of things that I'm going to assume about 3, because that seems to be a common age worldwide for children to be weaned when food is a scarce resource. Even in Israel, food was not always plentiful. It was a very agriculturally productive land. They produced an abundance of food. They exported food. Even their enemies depended upon them for food. And that's very often why they got attacked, is they needed more than they were able to buy, so, well, let's go steal it. But he was there to minister before the Lord. And I'm going to leave it there. He does successfully minister before the Lord, and he ministers before the Lord. He takes it internally, what his mother and father taught him about ministering before the Lord, what Eli and the other priests taught him about ministering before the Lord, and he ministers before the Lord his whole life. Holy Father, help us to minister before you with the understanding of how powerful you are, how you can reverse the fortunes of people. That if we should find ourselves in fortunate circumstance, to not get proud and think we did it, but to understand that you've blessed us with it, and that you can take it away from us just as easily. If things are hard and desperate, help us to understand you can still bring about victory in the situation. And that you are that kind of strong and powerful and wise and crafty and skilled, that it doesn't matter what we face, whether it's in this life or in life to come, you will bring about justice. You will bring about healing. You will bring about correction. There's nothing that's too strong for you. And you've promised for your people righteousness and justice and peace and judgment and destruction for those that oppose you and that aren't yours. Help us to be your servants like Samuel was, and that we would do whatever you find us to do, and we would do it well. In your holy name, amen. I hope to see you at church Wednesday night. If not, I hope to see you Sunday at worship. And if not, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.